Hey folks, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to be showing you how I mixed a female vocal to shine through and really be the star of this mix. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about before we even get to any of the plugins on the vocal track here is we're going to talk about the actual gain of the vocal itself, okay? So a female vocal part like this is usually pretty dynamic, okay? You can see we've got some loud sections here where she's really belting it out, and then we've got our quieter sections. They're a little bit more mellow, a little bit more controlled. So we don't want to immediately reach for a compressor and squash this vocal, okay? We don't want to do that. A female vocal can usually get very essy if you do that to it, and it'll usually pull out all the tone and character from it, okay? So what we want to do to get started is use our gain on our audio to get these right, okay? So we can come in here, just pull the gain up a little bit till it looks similar to the notes around it, okay? I've already gone through and done that on this track, as you can tell. That's why there's all these cuts here in between the loud and quieter parts, okay? We're pulling some of these things. It's pretty subtle on some of these, pulling everything back. See, just half dB moves, okay? We are letting the compressor do the bulk of the work because we don't want the vocal changes to sound too unnatural. We don't want it to go from sounding, really quiet to really loud like that, because this is a dynamic vocal part. You can see the piano makes those changes too. It's a dynamic song, so we don't want to go too crazy with it. But subtle moves can go a long way to helping your female vocal parts stay even and stay on top of the track, okay? Now we'll get into the actual vocal processing, okay? So, as I always do, we're starting off with an EQ, okay? We're getting rid of all of that extra low end that we don't need, okay? We're rolling up to 150 hertz here. Usually I'd probably be a little bit higher on a female vocal part like this, but she is reaching for some lower notes here, so we're leaving it down here at about 150 hertz, okay? So we can get that 200 area, that 200 weight on her lower notes, okay? So the first couple moves we're making here are some cuts, okay? And it's in this mid-range, low-mid area, okay? Like I said, she's hitting some lower notes here. So these lower cuts here at about 280 and 360 are to get rid of the mud and the buildup on those lower notes, okay? So this 281, I'm sorry, we're just doing a dB&1/2 cut, okay? And this is to make sure on those lower notes we're not getting too much above that 200, kind of 150 area where we want that heavy weight, okay? This next cut here, we've got at 360. This is usually our typical muddy area. On any vocal, when you're up on a microphone, you're going to get that low-mid mud, okay? So 360, we're pulling back 3 dB there, okay? It's not too much, but it's enough to balance out the vocal and get rid of that low-mid mud there and let our high end shine through a little bit more, okay? Now here's our typical cut on a female vocal, okay? We're up in this kind of nasally area, 900 hertz, okay? You can see I've narrowed the bandwidth a little bit because I don't want to cut too much into this mid-range area, and I don't want to pull too much out around this 1.5 to 2K area, okay? Because that's our mid-range that we need for the vocal to sit out front and sit on top of especially a piano track like this, okay? So just about 2.5 dB, a little bit over in this 900 hertz area again, and we're narrowing the Q a little bit so it doesn't pull too much out of the surrounding area, okay? Now our next move here is our boost, okay? And we're up at 8K here. This is where we're adding a little bit of that shine, so we get that female airy sound up top, okay? We're only doing a little bit, like I said. When you compress a female vocal like this that is naturally airy and they're pushing a lot of air out, you're going to exaggerate that air with the compressor, and with that you're going to exaggerate your S's and your P's and your T's like that, okay? So we're not doing too much here because the compressor is going to exaggerate that, okay? And then we'll have problems down the road that we'll have to take care of, okay? So that's our initial EQ, getting our vocal set right before it feeds into our compressor here, okay? So our compressor, this is where we're doing the bulk of our work, okay? We do have an EQ enabled here, but it's not really doing anything. It's maybe imparting a little bit of character because it is this vintage knee style EQ, but we're not making any moves on it. Initially, I believe I was doing this high-end boost on the knee VQ to impart a little bit of character, but it didn't need it. It was a little bit much. So we're moving to our compressor here, 4:1 ratio. We've got the standard settings I use when I'm compressing a vocal. So we've got our attack at about 0.5 milliseconds, and then our release is at 50 milliseconds, okay? So we're doing our usual 7 to 10 dB of compression, so we're really squashing the vocal, but it's not too much, like I said earlier, where we're stripping all the character out of this vocal, okay? We're at that mid-level where we're adding character and imparting vibe onto this vocal while also evening out it, okay? So you see we've got these louder sections, and then we head right into softer sections right after it, okay? Now, our piano part does the same thing, but not to the same extent, okay? We don't want our vocal to fall off too much after these high points in the song. So we're using this compressor to even it out a little bit, okay? So take a listen to this section here, and you can see the amount of compression we're doing and what it sounds like on this vocal, okay? Again, it's not too much. We're not over-exaggerating any parts of the vocal. We're not squashing it. We're not choking off notes. We're evening out the vocal, and we're imparting some vibe and some character from this FET style compressor, okay? So take a listen here.
I have already come.
Okay, so we're peaking off about, we're topping off at about -7 dB of compression. So we're not going to my usual kind of, rock, like -10 dB of compression, really piling it on there. We're pulling back just a little bit. Like I said, we did a little bit of gain compensation at the beginning, okay? We went in and edited our vocal, so some of these transitions between the louder parts and the quieter parts were a little bit smoother, taking some of the weight off, some of the work off of this compressor here, okay? Now, as we talked about earlier, that compressor is going to exaggerate our S's. It's going to bring our top end out a little bit, okay? But we don't want it to overpower the rest of her vocal, okay? We want her tone to stay even because she's got a beautiful range here, and we don't want that to be, overshadowed by S's popping out and T's popping out at the top, okay? So that's where we're using our Deesser here to bring down some of those exaggerated top end parts, okay? So we boosted with our EQ to get that pretty shine, that pretty air on top. Now we're using our multiband to control the parts that are a little bit too much, okay? So we're gonna listen to the second line here, and you can see our gain reduction up here at the top, right? You can see how much we're doing on those kind of S's and T notes, okay? Take a listen, and then take a look up here.
'Tis grace hath brought me safe.
Okay, so it's not much. We're just doing maybe 3 to 6 dB of compression on those top notes. So this is just from 4K up, okay? So 4K all the way up. The ratio is all the way up because we're using this as a Deesser, so it's more of a limiter style. And we're just doing 3 to 6 dB of compression on those notes, okay? We just want to tuck those S's, those T's, those kind of P notes into the rest of the vocal so her tone stays even. We're not overshadowing her awesome range with, these high notes poking out, okay? So that's our EQ pushing into our compressor, pushing into our multiband. Now we have a couple EQs here at the end doing more subtle stuff, okay? And a couple little fixes here at the end. So the next thing we're doing here, these are our subtle moves. We've got one kind of normal, regular move here in the middle. We're pulling out a little bit more, as you can see, this 900 hertz area, okay? So after all that compression, all that high mid, that mid-range area is going to come back up, okay? Because we're evening out her vocal tone. So we cut a little bit at the beginning, so it's not too much pushing into that compressor. And then we have to cut more after the compressor to, again, even out her vocal tone, okay? Because it was getting a little bit nasally in that area. Let me show you. I'll boost this up. You can hear what it sounds like.
I have already.
Okay? When she's hitting those higher notes, that's kind of the area where those notes are poking out, okay? So we're, again, a little bit narrower of a band width that a little bit narrower of a bandwidth than I would usually use, just so we don't affect the surrounding area too much, okay? Because this 500 hertz area, there's no problems there, so we can keep that in. It's just this, 800, 900, 1K area that we want to pull a little bit out, okay? Now, the rest of these moves here are pretty subtle, besides the low-pass filter, okay? So, in addition to our Deesser, we're using a little bit of a low-pass here But the low pass is kind of a tasteful move here, okay? So this is to give it a little bit more of a vintage vibe, because this is an older style song, so we don't want to go too heavy on the high end, right? Because that would be more of a modern sound when you have that pretty high end that goes all the way up, 20 hertz or 20K, I'm sorry. So we're using this low pass to trim that top stuff off a little bit to give it that kind of, more vintage vibe. So our top end doesn't extend all the way up. So the rest of these moves here are pretty subtle, okay? So we've got one here at 300, so we're pulling a little bit more back at that low mid area. Okay, I'll boost that up. You can see what that sounds like.
I have already.
Okay, just a little move there. It's pretty subtle, but it really helps keep that vocal even, okay? So we've got that subtle move here. There's a little pinch right here, which was probably a frequency poking out. Let's take a look.
I have already.
Yeah, some of those higher notes, that 1.9, that 2K area was poking out a little bit. So we're just pulling that back a dB, which is pretty subtle with this Q pulled all the way up like that, okay? But it's just something a little subtle. Maybe it was poking out on my speakers in this room. So we're just pulling it back just a little bit, okay? The next two moves here are our high mids and our high move. We're just tucking them back a little bit more, especially on these higher parts here when she's really belting it out. We don't want that high end to be too harsh. We don't want it to overshadow the rest of her tone, okay? So we've got a move here at 3.5K, and then we've got one at 7.5K, okay? That one's probably working in addition with our low pass filter, okay? So after I got my vocal set with our initial EQ, compression, and multiband, again, these are tasteful moves to kind of give it that more vintage vibe, okay? This one down here was probably something I heard after the fact. After the compression, a little bit more of that low mid area needed to be pulled out, and more of that mid-range area, that 900 hertz, needed to be pulled out after being evened out by that compressor. These two moves up here are to give it that vintage style vibe. So I mixed it kind of more modern sounding, how I'd want the female vocal to sound, and then I had to pull a little bit of that high end out, half a dB at 3.5K, half a dB at 7.5K, and then our low pass up at about 14, 15K to give it that kind of vintage vibe, okay, where our top end isn't really high and pretty and it doesn't extend all the way up, okay? It sits a little bit more with this piano, which had the top end rolled off a little bit more, okay? And then one final move here, which was probably after listening on the speakers in my room, a couple frequencies around the 4K area that we're poking out. These are pretty subtle too. We're only doing 2.5 dB, a dB here, and the Q is pulled all the way up. Those are pretty subtle, just a couple frequencies that we're poking out in my room here on these speakers. So these are translating moves to make sure it translates from headphones to the speakers here in my room, okay? We don't want our high-end area, our 4K, 5K area to poke out and be harsh, okay? Because we want this vocal to be pretty, okay? We want her to go from those awesome low notes to these really pretty high notes that she's belting out. And there's a couple falsetto parts too that we don't want these kind of whistly tones poking out on, okay? So that's what those two moves are, taking care of any harshness we have on the higher notes and the falsetto notes, okay? So that's how we got our vocal treated. Now, there is one other trick here to getting a female vocal part to sit right, and that's getting your reverb set correctly, okay? We don't want it to be a dry vocal, sitting way out front of this piano part, because the piano part does have some reverb on it. So we want to sit this vocal part in the room with the piano, okay? So we're sending to this reverb here. It's the normal reverb I'm using on my vocal, which is usually about 2 seconds with 152 millisecond pre-delay. But the keys here are we are compressing the reverb about 3 dB of compression. So on the louder notes, the reverb doesn't really take off in this room, and it's not like you don't hear it on these quieter notes, okay? So 3 dB of compression, 3 to 5 dB of compression on these louder notes will even out the tone coming off of the compressor, okay? Or coming off of the reverb, sorry. So we're sending our reverb into this compressor, okay? So our vocal's sending into the reverb, and then that reverb tone is sending into our compressor, and the compressor is evening out the reverb return, okay? So it's not exploding on these louder notes and non-existent on these quieter notes, okay? Otherwise, you'd be fighting to get a balanced reverb tones, okay? So this is evening that out. And then the other thing is we are heavily de-essing our reverb, okay? So on those falsetto parts, on those higher notes, it's not too excessive on our high end, okay? So that falsetto part, we don't want that high end on the reverb to overshadow her pretty high end on her vocal, okay? So this is taking care of those kind of whispery tones that you would get, riding out on your reverb. And I don't know if I did any, we're also doing a little bit of a low pass here on the EQ to take care of that in conjunction with the multiband, okay? So those are your steps. That's a breakdown of how I mix this female vocal to really shine through and sit on top of this mix, okay? Because this is just a piano vocal part, and you want the vocal to be the star here, okay? So we're taking care of the excessive dynamics, okay? We're going from really quiet parts to really loud parts. And that's we're using our clip gain and our compressor to even it out. We're balancing our tone with our EQ and our multiband, okay? So that's our de-esser. So she can have those really awesome low notes and then go to these really pretty high notes and these really, really pretty falsetto notes that she hits. And her vocal tone isn't going to be drastically changed. It's going to be pretty balanced and pretty even throughout this track, okay? Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that was helpful. If you have a female vocal part that you need mixed, click the link in the description, head on over to sumthinsrecording.com and request a quote for mixing on your next project. I will see you guys soon in the next video.